I stayed every time I begged you just to cuddle with me, and you started talking about your personal space issues. I stayed when I begged you to order groceries for 4 days instead of door dashing, and you wouldn't. I stayed when you wouldn't get out of bed and walk downstairs and get a credit card to change it so I could watch the one TV show I had been interested in years. I stayed all those times you were late for work because you just wouldn't get out of the bed. I stayed every time you came home from work pissed off and damn near crying because someone had hurt your feelings, but yet you made excuses for an hour about why you wouldn't go to therapy, or about how we couldn't afford you to go to therapy when we could. I stayed every time I dumped the entire litter box in the dumpster just because you wouldn't get out of bed and do it. I stayed every time I bought you something just to try and put you in a better mood, and you just went, thanks, I appreciate it, and went right back to complaining. I stayed when I stopped asking you for a goodnight kiss and you didn't even notice. I stayed as my shirt size and my pants size just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we ordered McDonald's for the second time that day. I stayed when I had to start a side business just to be able to get a couple of tattoos, buy some t-shirts, or have a nickel for myself, because we spent all of our money on DoorDash just to make sure you would eat. I stayed every time I wanted to go to a concert and couldn't because I didn't have a nickel in the bank, as you sat there and ate $60 worth of Chinese food. I stayed when I had to take a loan out of my 401k just to start feeling better about myself. I stayed as your closet filled up with shoes and you stayed on your side of the bed completely away from me. I stayed every time you said you were trying after you'd slept all weekend. I stayed when you started complaining about going to work on Monday morning on Friday afternoon. I stayed every time I rubbed your feet after I gave myself a new blister on mine just to put a smile on your face and so you would stop crying about work. I stayed every time I drove home from work exhausted and you had just gotten out of the bed. I stayed when you got up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and needed a nap by 2:30. I stayed every time you came home from work with a migraine, and I stayed downstairs on the couch so you could sleep. I stayed when I was worried about the engine blowing in my Jeep because it needed an oil change so bad, because I couldn't get you to stop ordering DoorDash so I could get an oil change. That one happened. I stayed when every time I tried to talk to you about my feelings, it made you cry and I wound up consoling you instead. I stayed while you made excuses about your behavior every time. I stayed every time you said you were sorry, but knowing goddamn good and well you were going to do it again. I stayed every time you had to put in the barest minimum of effort on anything, and instead you just went to bed. I stayed when getting a laundry basket down the stairs wore you out so bad you had to take a nap. I stayed when you wanted to adopt that homeless dog and I said yes just because it would make you happy and it would make you smile, and then it woke me up at 2 o'clock in the morning to play fetch. I stayed when you complained about the cat hair on your uniforms that you refused to hang up after I'd spent all day doing your laundry so you would have clean work clothes. I stayed. After that time, I literally spent my entire day off folding your laundry and setting it on the bed for you so that all you had to do was put it away. And instead, you just piled it up in the chair and went to bed. I stayed. That time I turned the bedroom into a spa and you wanted all of it changed in the first 2 minutes. I stayed. Every time I tried to talk to you about my day, and you went, "Oh, that sucks. I'm sorry," and went back to complaining about yours. I stayed as I made excuses to my friends why they couldn't come over to the apartment and watch baseball because of the shape it was in, because you wouldn't get out of bed and help me clean it at all. I stayed the day your mom knocked on the door every hour for 10 hours. I stayed every time you told me you wouldn't get up and go to the flea market with me on Saturday just because it made you uncomfortable. I stayed when you wouldn't go to the grocery store because it made you uncomfortable. I stayed when we wouldn't go to Walmart because it made you uncomfortable. I stayed every time you giggled and went, "I'm so lazy." I stayed when you explained to me why you switched to pre-rolls was because you were so lazy and you just didn't want to roll anymore. I stayed as we bought a mini fridge for the bedroom so you wouldn't have to get out of bed and go downstairs and get something to drink. I stayed when every time I said, "It's okay, baby, it's not a big deal," when you wouldn't watch my favorite movie with me every year for 4 years on my birthday. We've still never watched The Godfather Part 2 together. Ever. I stayed when the most affection I got was from our cats. I stayed as I was begging you to eat something besides fast food so we could save and take a vacation that we still haven't taken. I stayed every time you said, "I'm right where you left me" when I got home from work, and you really were right where I left you. In bed. I stayed when you gave up the gym after going twice. I stayed that time you got sick after donating plasma, and that was the last time you ever went back. I stayed when I had to go donate plasma to help pay the rent, but yet we were still buying DoorDash. I stayed when you called in sick from work because your period hurt so bad, but yet you went to your best friend's house that night. I stayed every time you were up long enough to smoke a joint, go get coffee, and go back to bed. I stayed as I paid for the delivery app for groceries you didn't use. I stayed when it took me 3 days to get you to order me stuff for lunch for work. I stayed every time I put off buying DJ gear to give you money to help pay your bills again. I stayed as we had to take out loans. I stayed when you came home from work and the house was clean and you just kept complaining about work. I stayed every time I cleaned the house and did your laundry, and the only thing I got from it was thanks. What do you want to order for dinner tonight? I stayed as my face kept getting puffier and puffier and puffier. I stayed as I went to the doctor to get antidepressants.